The tarnished challenge coin caught the fluorescent light as Sarah Chen's fingers found it in her scrub pocket, its surface worn smooth by 2 years of constant touch. She stood at the nurses' station of Seattle General's pediatric ICU at 3 in the morning, the witching hour when the hospital held its breath between shifts, and stared at the imaging scans on the monitor before her. 8-year-old Emma Webb's spinal MRI glowed in shades of gray and white, the degenerative compression visible at L4 and L5, the kind of diagnosis that made most surgeons close the chart and write palliative care in the margins. Sarah's eyes moved across the image with the precision of someone who had spent for months in a field hospital outside Fallujah reading imaging under generator light, diagnosing by instinct when the MRI machines didn't work and pain was information. She tilted her head. The angle was wrong. Not the pathology, the approach. Every neurosurgeon in the Pacific Northwest had apparently viewed this same scan and declared it inoperable, too risky, a one-way ticket to permanent paralysis or worse. They were looking at the problem from above. Sarah saw it sideways. "You're here early." Captain Marcus Webb's voice came from behind her, from his wheelchair parked at his daughter's bedside. He had been sitting there for 6 hours, the kind of devoted father watch that made ICU nights harder than any trauma bay. Webb was paralyzed from the waist down himself, a service-related injury from 6 months ago, a spinal wound that had taken him 12 weeks to even reach this hospital despite being stationed at Joint Base Lewis McChord just 40 minutes away. Sarah had been reading his case file, the delayed transport, the routing through 3 different facilities, the paper trail that didn't add up. That was why she was here. That was her actual mission. The night shift nursing job was her cover. "Couldn't sleep," Sarah said, her voice soft and deferential in a way that came naturally to a woman who had learned to move through hierarchies without creating ripples. She was 41 years old, with a limp that she'd perfected over months of practice to make it barely noticeable, the kind of injury you'd dismiss as an old ACL tear. Her hands were scarred across the knuckles, the kind of scars that came from something other than hospital work, but people saw what they wanted to see. Reviewing Emma's progress notes. Webb's jaw tightened. He knew what those notes said. Hopeless case. Long-term care facility. Accept the reality and let go. Dr. Caldwell was very clear yesterday, Webb said, his voice the controlled monotone of a Navy man trained to keep emotion out of critical communication. No surgical intervention. Prognosis stable but not improving. Sarah didn't respond. She moved to Emma's bedside and checked the 4-line, the heart monitor, the ventilation readings, all the small rituals of night shift nursing that kept hands busy when the mind was working on something else. The girl was unconscious, her small chest rising and falling in mechanical rhythm, the kind of trapped silence that surrounded all the hopeless cases. Sarah touched the challenge coin again. Captain Webb's unit insignia was barely visible on its tarnished surface, the metal worn thin by sand and sweat and 2 years of Sarah's constant pressure against it. He had given her that coin in Fallujah, pressed it into her hand when she'd asked him to trust her with something that mattered. He'd had no idea who she really was. He still didn't. The morning shift started at 6, and the fluorescent light seemed to burn brighter when the day crew arrived, a switch that flipped something in the hospital's nervous system. Sarah was in the cafeteria at 0647, pushing a tray with coffee and a protein bar, when Dr. Caldwell entered like weather moving through a room, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. He was tall, with the kind of jawline that could cut glass, expensive cologne mixing with the smell of antiseptic, his white coat pristine and tailored. He was flanked by 3 surgical residents, the kind of entourage that announced competence or arrogance depending on how you looked at it. Sarah looked at it as arrogance. She'd been trained to read competence, and this man wore his authority like a suit made from other people's suffering. Caldwell moved through the cafeteria line without actually looking at anyone, collected his espresso with a flick of his fingers, and turned to leave. His Rolex, a $12,000 Submariner, the kind of watch you wore to signal that you understood the true cost of things, caught the overhead light as he walked past Sarah's table. She didn't look up. She was still pushing her tray toward a seat when he turned, seemingly as an afterthought, and walked directly toward her. The residents trailed behind him like satellites orbiting a dying star. "Sarah, isn't it?" Caldwell said, his voice smooth as synthetic leather. It wasn't a question. He knew her name. The new night shift nurse. You've been asking questions about the Webb case. Sarah's hand froze on the tray. She set it down slowly on the table nearest her, her movements deliberate and measured. I reviewed her scans, Doctor. There may be nothing, Caldwell interrupted, his smile the kind that never reached his eyes. He stood close enough that his cologne formed a wall between them. Her case has been reviewed by 7 specialists. 7. Columbia, Stanford, Mayo, University of Washington Medical. Every single one of them concluded the same thing: any surgical intervention carries an unacceptable risk of catastrophic paralysis or death. He paused, and his smile widened. But you, a night shift nurse with no surgical training, you think you found something they all missed? The other staff members had stopped moving. The cafeteria had developed that particular quiet that came from people pretending not to listen while hearing everything. Sarah could feel it, the weight of attention, the pleasure in Caldwell's voice, the kind of moment that was designed to leave a mark. She had survived worse. She had survived Fallujah. She had survived interrogation by men who understood pain as a language. She kept her breathing steady. I was simply noting the imaging angle, Doctor. The compression pattern suggests. Caldwell reached out and struck her tray with a sweep of his hand. The coffee cup tipped, the liquid spilling across the table in a brown rush, the plate of eggs and toast spinning onto the floor with a sound like breaking glass. The residents made small sounds, gasps, uncomfortable laughter, but nobody moved to help. That's what happens when people stay in their lane, Caldwell said, his voice still smooth. When they step outside it, things break. He walked past her without waiting for a response, his residents trailing behind him like ships following a wake. The cafeteria resumed its normal sounds, the clatter of trays, the murmur of conversation, but it was a surface sound, covering something deeper. Everyone had seen. Everyone had taken note. Everyone understood the message. Sarah didn't move for exactly 3 seconds. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing never changed. Then she stood, and she retrieved the tray with movements that were precise and empty of emotion. She moved to the trash can and disposed of the spilled food, grabbed paper towels from the dispenser, and cleaned the floor with methodical efficiency. A younger nurse, one of the day shift staff, started to help, but Sarah held up a hand. I've got it, she said quietly. She always had it. That was the problem with people like Caldwell. They never understood that the people they pushed down were usually the ones who knew how to carry weight. She was walking back to the pediatric ICU when the morning shift briefing pulled in most of the floor staff to the conference room. Dr. Caldwell was there, standing at the front with his arms crossed, his presence dominating the space like a general addressing troops. He was explaining the stable cases, the ones expected to discharge, the long-term placements. Emma Webb came up in his presentation, a slide of her imaging, a discussion of the permanent nature of her condition. That's why we're expediting her transfer to Mercy Ridge Rehabilitation Facility, Caldwell said, clicking to the next slide. Sarah, standing at the edge of the room, recognized the logo, a private facility in Tacoma that specialized in long-term pediatric cases, the kind that generated consistent revenue from insurance billing and family donations. She also recognized the board members listed on their website. 2 of them were former colleagues of Caldwell's. 3 of them had recent gifts to his research foundation. They have excellent facilities, committed staff, and no false hope about recovery trajectories. She'll be comfortable there. That was when he saw Sarah at the back of the room. His eyes found hers for a moment, and something flickered across his face, a recognition that she was still here, still watching, still not broken by the tray incident. He smiled slightly, then returned to his presentation. But afterward, as the staff dispersed back to their stations, he intercepted her in the hallway outside Emma's room. He was holding a patient chart, and he held Sarah's gaze for exactly 2 seconds before he dropped it at her feet. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice soft enough that only she could hear it. "And stay out of cases that are above your pay grade." Sarah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She could feel the exact point where her composure began. It was a muscle, like any other muscle, and she had spent years training it. She picked up the chart without a word, her face an expressionless mask, her movements controlled and efficient. Caldwell turned and walked away, and Sarah stood there in the hallway holding Emma Webb's future in a manila folder. It wasn't until she was back in the supply closet at 0832, during the shift change when the hallway traffic was loudest, that she felt her hand move to the challenge coin. She pressed it between her thumb and forefinger, feeling the weight of it, the history of it. 2 years. She had been undercover for 2 years, placed here specifically to monitor Captain Webb's case, to investigate the pattern of delayed treatment, the suspicious routing through this hospital. A pattern that was starting to look less like incompetence and more like design. But that was above her pay grade, apparently. That was a case for people who wore expensive watches and drove wedges between doctors and nurses and families desperate for hope. She pulled the coin out and stared at it. The insignia was barely visible now, worn smooth by salt and sweat and 2 years of constant pressure. But she knew what it said. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company. The unit had called her the Blue Angel in Fallujah, though not to her face. That was what the Marines called the Navy medical personnel who moved through combat zones with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst. She had been a Master Chief Petty Officer then. She was a night shift nurse now. Same hands. Different war. She put the coin back in her pocket and returned to the floor. The emergency suture repair came at 11:47, a trauma admission from a construction accident, a man with a lacerated artery on his left forearm, bleeding out faster than the paramedics could manage. Sarah was called down to assist, and she moved into the procedure room with the kind of automatic precision that came from muscle memory. The attending was Dr. Marcus Sterling, visiting from Naval Medical Center San Diego, a combat medic taking a rotation through the civilian system. He was setting up the instruments when he looked up and saw Sarah prepping the suture line. "Who's doing the arterial closure?" Sterling asked. "I'll assist," Sarah said. She was already thinking about the approach, the damage pattern, the vessel integrity, the best way to restore flow without compromising the structural walls. She picked up the needle driver and the fine sutures, and her hands moved into position with the kind of automatic precision that didn't belong in a civilian hospital. 3 layers. The first layer approximating the intimal surface, the second layer reinforcing the media, the third layer reinforcing the adventitia. Each not placed with millimeter precision. Dr. Sterling froze mid-handoff, watching her fingers work. He stared at her 3-layer arterial closure for exactly 3 seconds, and then he looked up at her face. His expression shifted, recognition blooming across it like a photograph developing in solution. "Only one person ties off like that," he said quietly, not to anyone else, just to her. "Where did you serve?" Sarah's hands continued their work. She didn't pause. She didn't look up. She tied the final knot and stepped back from the table, her composure intact, her voice flat and deferential when she answered. "Just a nurse, doctor," she said. "I'm just a nurse." But her hands weren't shaking. Her hands had held lives together in worse places than this. And Dr. Sterling's eyes told her he knew exactly who was standing across from him, even if he couldn't quite believe it. Even if the woman in front of him didn't match any file or record he'd ever seen. Even if she was supposed to be dead. The rest of the surgery proceeded in silence, but something had shifted in the room. The air felt charged with questions that nobody could ask. When it was done, when the patient was stable and transferred to recovery, Dr. Sterling found Sarah in the hallway. "I need some jello," Sarah said before he could speak, dry humor clicking on like a switch, a joke only someone who had served would understand, referencing the Navy medical tradition of reward and recovery. "I'm going on break." Sterling almost smiled. He followed her to the break room, and he sat across from her at a table by the window that looked out over Portland's grey morning. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, very quietly, 2 years. Sarah looked at him. She didn't confirm anything. She didn't deny anything. She just looked at him, and that was confirmation enough. The morning sun cuts through the staff lounge windows at Seattle General like a blade. Dr. Caldwell sits at the corner table, navy suit crisp as fresh bandages, stirring his coffee with the kind of deliberate slowness that signals performance. 3 surgical residents orbit his chair like planets trapped in orbit, waiting for permission to sit. He doesn't offer it. "I'll give it a week before our little night shift hero quits," he announces, his voice carrying across the break room with surgical precision. The words land like scalpel strikes. "I'm taking bets." "Any takers?" Nervous laughter. The kind that tastes like metal and compliance. Sarah enters through the side door, her hospital badge clipped to scrub pocket, ready to clock out after a 16-hour shift. Her face is a blank slate, the kind of composure that comes from having already survived worse. Much worse. The kind of composure earned in Fallujah, in field hospitals where emotion was a luxury you couldn't afford. She walks past Caldwell's table toward her locker without acknowledgement. Her hands are steady. Her breathing even. "Oh, speak of the devil," Caldwell calls after her, his voice rising just enough to draw attention. "Chen, how long have you been a nurse? 2 years? 3? She doesn't turn. Her fingers work her combination lock with the precision of someone defusing ordnance. "For years, doctor." "For whole years," he repeats, leaning back in his chair, "and you think you can second-guess Stanford-trained neurosurgeons?" His smile is the smile of a man who has never been told no. "That's adorable." Sarah pulls her jacket from her locker. The challenge coin in her pocket presses against her ribs like a second heartbeat, tarnished silver, weathered from 6 years of service, bearing the insignia of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group. She touches it once through the fabric. Not now. She closes her locker and walks out without responding. What Caldwell doesn't know is that Sarah documented every word. Not in writing. In memory. In the same mental filing system that once catalogued enemy positions in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province. She recognized the play immediately, calculated psychological warfare, designed to destabilize, designed to make her quit before she could expose what she discovered in Emma Webb's chart. He was making a mistake. He was treating her like a nurse. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer of the United States Navy. Interrogation tactics designed for civilians didn't work on people who'd been trained to resist worse. 2 days later, the cafeteria during morning shift change. Peak density. 40 staff members. Maximum witnesses. Sarah carries her breakfast tray past Caldwell's table, scrambled eggs, toast, orange juice, coffee. Her movements are economical, precise, the way someone moves when they've learned that wasted motion gets people killed. She's 5 feet from his chair when she sees his foot extend, just slightly, timing it with her step. The tray hits the floor. Eggs scatter like shrapnel. Orange juice spreads across white tile in a brilliant stain. The cup shatters. Coffee steams up in a brief, acrid plume. The room goes dead silent. 40 pairs of eyes. Caldwell doesn't even glance at her. He's still looking at his phone, his expression arranged into something approaching boredom. "Clumsy," he mutters, just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. 3 attendings smile. The residents laugh softly, permission granted. Sarah kneels without hesitation. Her face reveals nothing, not anger, not embarrassment, not the trembling that would satisfy him. She gathers scattered utensils with methodical precision. Her fingers work the tile, soaking up juice with napkins, her movements controlled and economical. A nursing assistant rushes over to help, but Sarah waves her off with a slight head shake. This is hers to clean. She finishes alone, stands, and walks to the dish return as if nothing happened. Her scrubs are spotless. Her composure is titanium. Only later, alone in the supply closet during her break, does her hand finally tremor. She reaches into her pocket and touches the challenge coin, her fingers trembling against the tarnished metal for exactly 4 seconds before her breathing levels again. She pockets it. Goes back to work. The third humiliation comes during afternoon rounds on the pediatric floor. Sarah presents Emma Webb's imaging, 8-year-old daughter of Captain Marcus Webb, Navy. Paralyzed from the waist down. Every specialist has said inoperable. Every specialist except Sarah, who sees something in the neural compression patterns that the Stanford-trained mind somehow missed. I'd like to suggest an alternative imaging review, Sarah says, her voice steady as a metronome, before we finalize the recommendation for long-term rehabilitation placement. Caldwell listens for exactly 10 seconds. Then he picks up the patient chart, not casually, with intention, and throws it at her feet. Papers scatter across the hallway floor like snow. 6 medical students and 2 attendings stand frozen, watching the choreography of humiliation. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Caldwell says, his voice dripping contempt like blood from a wound. "And next time, remember that nurses observe. Doctors decide." Sarah's jaw clenches. That's the only sign. Just a tightening along her mandible. The trembling isn't fear, it's restraint. Her hands remain steady as she kneels, gathering scattered pages. Her face stays blank, professional, revealing nothing. But as she collects the final pages, she notices something. Emma's medication dosage has been altered. Someone changed the orders since yesterday. That wasn't a clinical adjustment. That was deliberate. Over the next 3 days, Sarah spends her breaks cross-referencing Emma Webb's chart with the hospital's medication logs. She photographs evidence with her personal phone, encrypted, routed through servers she doesn't legally have access to, sent to an address that doesn't officially exist. The pattern is unmistakable. Caldwell has been subtly increasing neurological suppressants while decreasing anti-inflammatory medications. A combination that accelerates spinal deterioration. A combination that transforms a treatable condition into a permanent disability. A combination that requires long-term rehabilitation placement at Cascade Rehabilitation Facility, which pays Dr. Caldwell approximately $47,000 per referral. She runs the mathematics 3 times. Checks her work. Confirms. In the ICU break room during the night shift, Sarah overhears Caldwell on his phone through the cracked door. "Yes, Richard, I've got another one," he says, his voice smooth as oil. Emma Webb. 8 years old. Father's a Navy captain, benefits are excellent. Military families don't fight the system. A pause. The usual arrangement applies, yes. 50-50 split on the 5-year placement. Another pause. She should be ready for transfer by end of month. Sarah's hand goes still. She touches her pocket, the challenge coin presses against her ribs like a second heart, beating in a rhythm only she can hear. Her undercover mission just revealed its full architecture. Captain Marcus Webb's delayed treatment 6 months ago, his daughter's sudden paralysis, the referral scheme that funnels military families into unnecessary extended care while the VA pays 3 times what civilian insurance would. This isn't just fraud. This is predation. During a routine dressing change on Emma's pressure sore, a visiting combat medic from the 1st Marine Division assists. His maybe mid-40s, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having seen things. His name badge reads Sergeant First Class Holloway, JSOC. Sarah performs a complex wound closure, her hands moving with the muscle memory of field hospitals in Fallujah. 3-layer technique, subcutaneous, dermal, epidermal, each suture placed with the precision of someone who learned under mortar fire. The medic hands her instruments, and she works without speaking. Then he freezes. "Only one person ties off like that," Holloway whispers, his voice shaking slightly. "Where did you serve?" Sarah's hands don't pause. She snips the final suture. "I'm just a nurse," she says flatly. Holloway stares at her for 10 long seconds. Then he backs away slowly, his face pale. He leaves without another word. Sarah knows what he saw. He recognized the signature technique she perfected during 3 tours. There's only one person in modern combat medicine who ties off that way, the Blue Angel. Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. Delta Operator. SEAL Medical Unit Commander. The one they call Al-Malik al-Azraq in Arabic-speaking regions. The legend that most people assume is dead. That night, she finds Emma's medication orders altered again. Dosages that will trigger a respiratory crisis within hours. The timing is precise. The intent is clear. Sarah's phone buzzes once. She doesn't check it, she already knows what it says. Captain Webb sent confirmation. He's been inserted on campus, undercover as a maintenance worker, waiting for the signal. Sarah texts him, "Keep your phone close tonight." She positions herself at the nurse's station with direct line of sight to Emma's room. The fluorescent lights hum their mechanical hymn. The ventilators wheeze their rhythmic breathing. The monitors blip and beep in their endless digital chorus. She waits. At 02 for 7 hours, Emma's monitor alarms begin screaming. The medication log sat in Sarah's hands like evidence from a crime scene. 3 consecutive 16-hour shifts. 72 hours of cross-referencing pharmacy records against physician orders, her eyes tracking the digital timestamps like a hunter reading tracks. Dr. Caldwell's prescriptions for Emma Webb didn't match the medication administration times. The gaps were precise. Deliberate. The neurological suppressants, baclofen, dantrolene, even low-dose phenobarbital, were being administered in escalating doses despite orders for tapering. Each increase matched perfectly with Emma's declining motor function over the past 6 weeks. It wasn't medical progression. It was sabotage. Sarah sat in the empty break room at 0327 hours, the fluorescent lights buzzing like angry wasps overhead, her coffee gone cold beside the scattered printouts. The pattern had revealed itself slowly, piece by piece, but now the whole architecture of it lay exposed. She'd seen this kind of systematic poisoning before, not with toxins, but with medicine weaponized as a tool. Pain is data, her old combat surgeon used to say. And the data screaming from these logs was unmistakable. She pulled up the second layer of evidence. Cascade Rehabilitation Partners. A private facility in Bellevue, 23 miles north of Seattle General. Sarah had cross-referenced the business filings this morning during her lunch break, sitting in the supply closet with her encrypted phone. Dr. Richard Caldwell held a silent partnership stake, 42,000 shares purchased 5 years ago, held through a shell company registered in Delaware. The facility specialized in long-term pediatric spinal cases. Hopeless cases. The kind that generated consistent insurance revenue for years, sometimes decades. Families didn't sue hopeless cases. They accepted them. The financial trail was almost beautiful in its simplicity. Caldwell diagnoses a child as untreatable. Caldwell's deteriorating treatment accelerates the decline. Caldwell refers the family to Cascade. Caldwell's shares increase in value. Cascade collects insurance payments, therapy fees, equipment rentals. The cycle was elegant, predatory, and, according to her preliminary calculations, had generated approximately $870,000 in Caldwell's personal portfolio over the past 4 years. But that wasn't the worst part. Sarah pulled up the second file. Captain Marcus Webb's medical records from 6 months prior. She'd accessed them carefully, logged in as a standard nursing account that wouldn't trigger alerts. The paralysis that kept him in that wheelchair had arrived suddenly, catastrophically, within hours of a routine spinal imaging procedure at this same hospital. The radiologist's report noted unusual post-procedure neurological deterioration. Unusual. That was the word they used when something didn't make sense, but the attending physician wasn't asking questions. Sarah's jaw tightened infinitesimally as she reviewed the operative notes. Caldwell had performed a routine diagnostic lumbar puncture. Straightforward procedure. Low risk. Except the documented contrast agent didn't match what had actually been ordered. The pharmacy record showed standard iohexol. The procedure notes listed a different solution entirely, one with no neurotoxic properties when introduced directly into the spinal column at high concentration. It wasn't an accident. The substitution was too precise. Caldwell had paralyzed Captain Webb deliberately, methodically, establishing false disability to justify long-term care referrals. To justify military family referrals. Sarah's hands remained steady as she collated the evidence, but her breathing deepened. Military families. Captain Webb wasn't her first case file. She'd recognized the pattern 3 weeks ago when she cross-referenced the Cascade Rehabilitation Partners client list against the Veterans Affairs database. 47 military families. 47 referrals from Caldwell. 47 deliberate disability placements. The financial overlap between Caldwell's referrals and the facility's insurance payouts was irrefutable. $11.3 million in 3 years. Targeting the families least likely to pursue litigation, active duty, deployed, traumatized, vulnerable. The monitor on the wall clicked to 02 for 7 hours. Sarah's phone buzzed silently in her pocket. She already knew what it was. The medication administration times had been flagged in her mental timeline since midnight. Emma's latest injection, baclofen dose increased by 40% from yesterday, should be reaching peak concentration right now. Combined with the residual phenobarbital from the morning shift and the dantrolene already in her system, Emma's spinal cord would be compressed under a pharmaceutical avalanche. Muscle function suppressed. Respiratory depression incoming. Within minutes, her oxygen saturation would begin to slide. Within 4 minutes, without intervention, Emma Webb would suffer catastrophic brainstem compression. Her breathing would stop. Her brain would die. Sarah stood without rushing, without the frantic energy of someone who panicked. She moved with the terrifying fluid precision of a person who'd already calculated 17 contingencies and chosen the one that saved the most lives. She was on the pediatric ICU floor before the monitor alarmed. She knew the moment it would scream before it screamed. The alarm came at 02 for 8 hours, a shrieking wail that yanked night shift into sudden chaos. Emma's oxygen saturation was dropping. 94, 88. 79, the numbers fell like stones down a well. Her respiratory rate was slowing, her lips already taking on the faint blue tinge of hypoxia. Sarah was in the room before the duty nurse finished her first step, muscle memory from field hospitals in Fallujah overriding protocol, overriding caution, overriding the 2 years of careful investigation that was about to detonate. Get me a decompression kit. 14-gauge angiocath needle, size 4.0 pediatric endotracheal tube, and Reboa balloon catheter if we have it. Her voice had dropped an octave. Not a request. A command. The resident froze mid-motion. Sarah didn't repeat herself. She was already prepping Emma's back, swabbing the skin with antiseptic, the chemical smell sharp and industrial under the fluorescent hum. Captain Webb appeared in the doorway, his wheelchair nearly tipping as he lurched forward, his face decomposing with terror. What's happening? Why is she? His voice cracked like old wood. Spinal pressure spiked catastrophically, Sarah said, her hands moving on their own. She could see the compression in the imaging she'd studied for weeks, Emma's vertebrae pinching her brainstem like a vice. She'll have brain death in 4 minutes if I don't decompress. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second. I need you to block that door. No one comes in for the next 8 minutes. Not the resident. Not the attending. No one. Captain Webb understood command structure. He understood the weight of that request. He wheeled himself backward and positioned his chair squarely in the doorway, not blocking it completely, but making entry complicated, slow. He was buying her time. Sarah's hands found the anatomical landmarks by memory, the spinous processes, the space between L4 and L5, the exact angle of insertion that would reach the epidural space without piercing the dura mater. The needle went in with a small hiss of air, the pressure releasing like a held breath. She guided the catheter through, her fingers steady as surgical lasers, performing an emergency decompression laminectomy right there in the ICU, not the full surgical approach, but the field hospital emergency version that worked when sterile technique and equipment were luxuries you didn't have. Emma's oxygen saturation stabilized. 79, 81. 84, 87. Color returned to her face like life seeping back into marble. Her breathing deepened, the terrible shallow gasping replaced with regular, steady respiration. 02 sat climbing. 88, 91. 94, Sarah was closing the final layer of closure with sutures thin as spider silk when the footsteps came. Dr. Caldwell burst through the door at 0256 hours, his body driving forward with such force that Captain Webb's wheelchair rolled backward like it weighed nothing. His face had gone purple, veins bulging on his forehead like blue wires under skin. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was a roar. "You're performing surgery. You're practicing medicine without a license. That's a felony." Spit flew from his mouth. "That's your career. That's your freedom." Sarah continued suturing without looking up, her hands completing the final knot with absolute precision. Her voice, when it came, was flat as concrete. Patient was coding. "I stabilized her." Caldwell's hands shook as he grabbed his phone. He was already dialing, already talking, his words tumbling over each other in frantic rage. "David? It's Richard Caldwell. I need you to call the State Licensing Bureau right now. I have a nurse, a night shift nurse at Seattle General, who just committed a felony in my ICU. Direct surgery performed without authorization. Without credentials. Yes. Now. I'm documenting everything." He hung up and turned to Sarah, his voice dropping to something colder, more controlled. "You're finished. Do you understand? I'm going to burn your career so completely there won't be a hospital in 3 states that'll let you change bedpans." Sarah tied off the final suture and stepped back. Emma Webb's vital signs were stable. Her oxygen saturation was 96%. Her respiratory rate was normal. She was going to live, not just survive, but live, because a Master Chief Petty Officer had performed an emergency procedure in a pediatric ICU in Portland, Oregon, and in doing so, had detonated 2 years of meticulous investigation. The security guard arrived at 0312 hours. Then the administrator. Then the compliance officer. Sarah's security badge was deactivated by 0347 hours. Her locker was emptied into a cardboard box by 0401 hours. Hospital security escorted her to her car with the formal politeness of people removing a potential criminal from the building. The morning shift was arriving as she walked toward the exit, nurses and residents clustering near the break room, talking in low voices. The story would spread like wildfire by morning rounds. A night shift nurse. Unauthorized surgery. Practicing medicine without a license. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her investigation, 2 years of careful documentation, of pattern recognition, of financial forensics, was now compromised. The evidence she'd been building toward the Pentagon investigation was attached to a nurse who'd just committed a dramatic public felony. Any lawyer worth their billing hours would claim entrapment, illegal investigation, bias. Caldwell's 20-year career would survive. His kickback scheme would continue. 47 military families would keep being referred to a facility that profited from their desperation. Captain Webb caught up with her in the parking lot. His wheelchair moved fast across the asphalt, his arms powerful from years of compensating for his manufactured paralysis. "What did I just do to you?" His voice was raw. "Destroyed. I pushed you into, Sarah," I heard what he said. "You performed surgery. That's..." Sarah stopped walking. The pre-dawn air was cold, carrying the metallic smell of rain coming from the west. She reached into her scrub pocket and pulled out the challenge coin, the one he'd pressed into Emma's hand before his last deployment. The metal was tarnished dark, the Navy SEAL trident barely visible on its surface, worn smooth by decades of being carried, touched, worried like a prayer. "This was in her fist during the surgery," Sarah said quietly. "She never let go. Not once." She pressed the coin into his hand and walked toward her car without waiting for a response. Behind her, Captain Webb stood in the middle of the parking lot, the tarnished coin heavy in his palm, the weight of it suddenly meaning something entirely different than it had yesterday. Sarah drove away into the pre-dawn darkness, her 2-year investigation burning behind her like Portland disappearing in a rearview mirror. Emma Webb's oxygen saturation plummets at 2:56 a.m. on a Tuesday, the monitor's wail cutting through the pediatric ICU like a siren warning of incoming casualties. Sarah's head snaps up from the medication cart, her eyes finding the numbers before her body moves. 92. 88. 83. The girl's small chest rises and falls in shallow, labored gasps, her lips taking on the faint blue tinge of hypoxia, the exact shade Sarah has seen on field hospital patients losing the fight for oxygen. She moves before the attending can call code, muscle memory overriding protocol, her hand steady as surgical lasers as she checks the foredrip, the medication line, the oxygen delivery. That's when she sees it. The saline bag has been replaced. The dosage notation on the chart reads increased per Dr. Caldwell's orders, 0245 hours, 30 minutes before the crash, 15 minutes before Sarah came on rounds. The medication isn't saline. It's a neurological suppressant, the kind that shuts down respiratory drive in incrementally lethal doses. Caldwell hasn't just altered Emma's medication. He's orchestrated this moment. He's forced the crisis that will justify the emergency transfer to Cascade Rehabilitation, where he collects $15,000 per referral, where long-term hopeless cases spend months in a private facility generating profit margins that would make a cardiologist weep. Sarah's jaw doesn't move. Her hands don't shake. She turns to the resident frozen beside her, "Get me a pediatric laminectomy setup." Level 1 response. Now. The resident stares. That's, we need attending authorization, we need, now. Not a request. A command. Her voice has dropped an octave, the deferential nurse persona evaporating like water from hot asphalt. Emma's oxygen climbs to 79. The girl's eyes are rolling back, consciousness slipping away, and somewhere in her tiny spinal cord the pressure is building. The inflammation Caldwell's medication has been triggering for weeks finally reaching critical mass, crushing the nerves that control her lungs. Sarah's already moving to the supply cabinet, muscle memory from Fallujah field hospitals, from operating on combat casualties intense with mortar rounds walking closer with each impact. She grabs the emergency surgical kit, 14-gauge spinal needle, local anesthetic, sterile field setup, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who has performed this procedure 47 times under gunfire. The resident starts to protest. A nurse grabs her arm. "That's not protocol, we can't just..." Sarah's eyes meet the nurse's for exactly 1 second, and whatever the resident sees in their gaze, whatever recognition of authority, whatever weight of experience, makes her step back. Sarah positions Emma on her side, palpates the L4-L5 space with her fingers, the anatomical landmarks as familiar to her as her own reflection. She swabs the area with betadine, the amber liquid spreading in a perfect circle, the smell of antiseptic sharp and clean and exactly like every other crisis Sarah has ever walked into. 60 seconds, she says to the room. "That's all I need. Someone keep monitoring O2. If it drops below 60, say my name." Her hand steady as glacial ice, Sarah inserts the spinal needle through the ligamentum flavum, feeling the subtle give as the needle breaks through into the epidural space. She threads the catheter with the precision of someone threading a needle in a sandstorm, and the moment the catheter is in place, fluid rushes out, clear cerebrospinal fluid under massive pressure, the build-up that's been crushing Emma's spinal cord for weeks as Caldwell's medication accelerated the inflammation. Emma gasps. Her color improves. 78. 82. 87. 91. Sarah's other hand is already working on the 3-layer arterial closure technique, the one that only one person ties, the one that made combat medics stop mid-procedure and ask where she learned it, and she completes the vascular seal with sutures so precise. They look like they were placed by a machine, not human hands. Emma's oxygen climbs to 96. The girl's breathing steadies, the panicked gasping transforming into normal pediatric respiration, her lips fading from blue to pink as her brain gets oxygen again. O2 98, someone whispers. Emma's eyes flutter, consciousness returning, and her hand reaches out, searching. Sarah is there, her hand steady on the girl's forehead, and for a moment, just a moment, the mask slips enough for Emma to see something in Sarah's face that isn't nurse, isn't civilian, isn't anything her 8-year-old brain has a word for. It's protector. It's warrior. It's the kind of person you call when everyone else has given up. The ICU falls into the strange silence of a successful crisis averted, and then the doors slam open. Dr. Caldwell stands in the doorway, his face purple with rage, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes snap from Emma to Sarah to the emergency surgical setup, and understanding crashes over his features like a wave hitting concrete. His voice, when it comes, is quiet and terrifying. "What have you done?" Not a question. An accusation. Sarah's composure is absolute. She doesn't turn away from Emma's monitor. She doesn't defend herself. She simply states, spinal pressure relief. 3-layer vascular closure. Patient is stable. Caldwell's face goes from purple to white. He reaches for his phone with the kind of motion that suggests he's about to make a call that will burn down this entire ward, this entire investigation, this entire 2-year operation that Sarah has built layer by layer like a 3-layer arterial closure. He's calling the board president, his medical school roommate, the man who rubber stamps everything Caldwell does. "I want her arrested for practicing medicine without a license," he hisses into the phone, his voice no longer controlled, now edged with panic. "She just performed an authorized surgery on a pediatric patient. Emergency decompression. I have witnesses. I want her removed from this facility within the hour." Sarah hears every word. Her hands don't shake. Her breathing doesn't change. She completes the monitor check on Emma Webb, documents the vitals in the chart with perfect clinical notation: O2 sat 98%, HR 94, BP normalized, patient conscious and responsive, and only then does she step back. A security officer appears in the ICU doorway. Then another. The head of hospital operations walks past them, her face carefully neutral, her phone already in her hand. Sarah sees the calculation happening behind the operations director's eyes: lawsuit liability, regulatory investigations, the word unauthorized echoing louder and louder. She knows how this plays out. She's seen it 1,000 times in theaters of operations where politics matter more than outcomes. The truth is secondary to jurisdiction. The dead matter less than the paperwork. "Ms. Chen, you're going to need to come with us," the first security officer says, and he says it gently, which makes it worse somehow. Sarah looks at Emma Webb one more time. The girl's eyes are open now, scared but breathing, the arterial closure holding, the spinal pressure relieved, the crisis averted. She's going to walk again. She's going to live. That much is guaranteed now, written in the physiology of her body and the structural integrity of her spinal cord. Sarah nods to the second night nurse, someone competent, someone who will monitor Emma like her life depends on it, because it does. "Keep her on continuous monitoring for the next 4 hours," Sarah says. "Watch the O2 like it's your job, because it is now." Then she turns and follows the security officers out of the ICU, down the corridor, past the nursing station where exhausted residents stare, past the elevator bank where a night shift clerk gasps, past the main entrance where the Portland rain hammers against the glass doors. The drive to the parking lot takes 90 seconds. The escort takes less than a minute. Sarah's badge is deactivated before her feet touch the asphalt. The electromagnetic lock clicking off with a sound like a gun bolt being chambered. They don't let her retrieve her personal items from her locker. They don't let her call anyone. They walk her to the parking lot with the kind of procedure usually reserved for security breaches and active threats, and Sarah understands with absolute clarity her cover is blown. Her investigation is compromised. 2 years of work, patient interviews conducted as casual conversation, medication records photographed under the guise of routine work, Caldwell's phone calls recorded through equipment hidden in a bathroom electrical outlet, all of it is now tainted by this single moment of humanity. She chose to save Emma Webb. The consequence is that every military family Caldwell has harmed, every veteran denied proper care, every child funneled into unnecessary rehabilitation, all of that is now on her conscience instead of in a federal indictment. The rain is cold on her face as she drives away from Seattle General at 03 for 7 hours, the hospital disappearing in her rearview mirror, and somewhere inside her chest Sarah feels something break that isn't physical, something that won't show up on any monitor or chart, something that only soldiers understand, the weight of choosing one life over a mission. The Starlight Diner sits empty at 0317 hours, the kind of place that exists in the margins between night shift and dawn, fluorescent lights buzzing like insects trapped in plastic. Sarah Chen occupies a corner booth, her coffee gone cold an hour ago, the ceramic mug leaving a dark ring on the laminate table. Rain hammers the windows with the kind of insistence that sounds like accusation. She stares at her reflection in the glass, a ghost made of shadow and neon, barely recognizable as human. 2 years. 730 days of embedded investigation. 43 conversations with hospital administrators. 17 documented instances of medication tampering. 6 families denied proper care. 1 8-year-old girl who should have been dead by Tuesday. Instead, Emma Webb is breathing. Sarah touches her fingertips to the scar on her left forearm, a thin white line running from wrist to elbow, shrapnel from Fallujah, 2009, the kind of wound that stops bleeding but never stops talking. The silence in the diner is the kind of silence that only comes after you've chosen something and lost everything else. She doesn't feel it yet. The shock is still holding everything in place like a tourniquet. But she knows, the way soldiers know, that when shock releases, the real damage will show. The tarnished challenge coin sits on the table before her, placed there 10 minutes ago when her hand started to shake. She doesn't allow trembling in public, not anymore, so she'd driven away from Seattle General, found this diner, and let her hands do what they needed to do in the dark. The coin is brass and dented, stamped with the insignia of SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon, the Fallujah emblem barely visible beneath 2 layers of oxidation. She'd carried this coin for 14 years. Captain Marcus Webb had pressed it into his daughter's hand before his last deployment, the same way his own father had pressed it into his. The same coin Emma had clutched in her small fist while Sarah's hands moved with muscle memory that no civilian nurse possessed, performing a surgical decompression at bedside with nothing but an 18-gauge needle and the kind of calm that only comes from having already survived worse. She saved the girl. She destroyed the case. The rain continues its assault on the glass. Somewhere in the building next to the diner, a siren wails and fades toward the hospital she'd just abandoned. Sarah closes her eyes and lets herself wonder, for exactly 30 seconds, if she made the right choice. 30 seconds is enough. After 30 seconds, a soldier moves forward. After 30 seconds, regret becomes irrelevant. She pockets the coin and orders more coffee from a waitress who doesn't recognize what she's looking at. 3 days pass in the kind of silence that precedes storms. Sarah receives a certified letter notifying her of a board hearing at Seattle General. She doesn't attend the first meeting, doesn't need to. The hearing convenes in Conference Room A on the 3rd floor, packed tight with hospital administrators whose faces are the color of spooked cattle, attorneys whose legal pads are already filling with liability assessments, and risk management consultants who've seen this movie before and know how it ends. The board president, a man named Sterling whose medical school diploma hangs in a frame that costs more than Sarah's car, sits at the head of a mahogany table that stretches like a runway. Dr. Richard Caldwell occupies a chair that suddenly feels too small for him, his face the gray of hospital walls, his hands folded on the table with the kind of precision that means he's terrified. They've reviewed the incident report. They've interviewed the emergency department staff. They've examined Emma Webb's medication chart, the discrepancies now obvious to anyone who isn't blinded by profit. The board president opens his mouth to speak, and that's when the doors open. Captain Marcus Webb wheels through in a navy dress uniform, and the room's atmospheric pressure shifts like a helicopter landing. He's not supposed to be mobile. His paralysis, documented, photographed, written into medical records by Caldwell himself, should keep him planted in a wheelchair for the remainder of his life. Webb positions himself at the foot of the table and nods to someone behind him. A man enters. Middle-aged, dark eyes, Iraqi accent sharp as a blade, Dr. Bashir al-Nur, formerly of Fallujah Regional Hospital, now consulting with the Veterans Affairs medical system. The moment Bashir's eyes find Sarah's chair empty, but they don't know that yet, his face drains of all color. His hand goes to his mouth. Al-Malik al-Azraq, he whispers, the words falling like stones into still water. The Blue Angel. The legend. The impossible. A security guard stands. He's older, maybe 60, carrying himself like someone who's learned to move quietly in hostile territory. His name tag reads Mitchell, Veteran Services. His voice, when he speaks, carries the weight of someone who's seen real things. Sir, that's Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen. She ran the most decorated SEAL medical unit in theater. 3 tours. The hospital network didn't know who they were standing next to. The room goes dead silent. 10 full seconds of it, the kind of silence where you can hear the fluorescent lights humming their electronic prayer, where the rain against the windows sounds like static on a dead channel, where every administrator suddenly understands they've been playing poker with someone holding a loaded weapon they didn't see. The board president's voice, when it comes, is smaller. Where is she? Captain Webb takes a long breath. His hands grip the wheelchair's wheels, and then, impossibly, he pushes himself upright. His legs hold. His balance holds. He stands in his navy dress uniform like a man who's been walking all along, and places a tarnished challenge coin on the mahogany table. The coin spins once, twice, comes to rest. Master Chief Chen spent 2 years embedded in this hospital, Webb says, and his voice is steady as a surgical laser. Investigating a fraud network systematizing harm against military families. She discovered that Dr. Caldwell was deliberately delaying treatment for my injury 6 months ago. She found evidence he was altering medication dosages, specifically for patients with military connections, to accelerate deterioration and guarantee referrals to Cascade Rehabilitation, a facility he owns equity in. She documented quarterly deposits matching patient transfers. She was 3 weeks from presenting her findings to federal authorities. The coin glints in the fluorescent light. Then my daughter stopped breathing. Through the glass wall of conference room A, someone's phone pings. Then pings again. Then 10 phones ping at once, a cascade of digital emergency signals. The medical student's video has surfaced. 12 hours ago, forwarded through social media, it shows Dr. Caldwell in the cafeteria, chart in his hand, Sarah standing motionless before him. His voice crystal clear, "Pick that up, sweetheart." His sneer visible. His contempt audible. The video has 2 million views. It's climbing. Dr. Caldwell stands abruptly. The chair slides backward and topples. "This is entrapment," he shouts, and the room's temperature drops 10 degrees because when a physician shouts, it means the architecture of his world is collapsing. She's a military operative conducting illegal surveillance. She has no authority. I've been practicing 23 years. I'm the chief of... The board president's phone rings. He answers, his face going the color of ash. He listens for 4 seconds and says, "That was Johns Hopkins." The name lands like a grenade. Dr. Samuel Morrison. Caldwell's medical school mentor. A decorated army surgeon. A legend in neurosurgical circles, the kind of surgeon whose opinion determines whether careers ascend or crater. Caldwell's hand begins to shake as he takes the phone into the hallway. The room watches through the glass wall as his face crumbles, not the collapse of a guilty man, but the collapse of a man realizing he's not important enough to protect. He returns 3 minutes later in complete silence and sets the phone on the table. The board president puts it on speaker. Morrison's voice fills the conference room like a knife cutting through darkness. "Richard, I watched the video. I watched you humiliate a Master Chief Petty Officer who saved more lives in one deployment than you will in your entire career. I am formally requesting Johns Hopkins remove your name from our alumni directory. I am writing to the American Board of Neurological Surgery recommending review of your certification. And I am personally ashamed to have ever called you my student." The line goes dead. The silence after it is deeper than the silence before. Within 48 hours, 3 additional specialists contact the board with their own documentation of Caldwell's referral scheme. The state medical board opens a formal investigation. Federal authorities execute a search warrant at Cascade Rehabilitation. Hospital legal counsel terminates Caldwell's privileges and reports him to the Department of Justice for healthcare fraud. His practice implodes like a star collapsing inward, partners distance themselves, referrals vanish, malpractice insurance is cancelled. The State Bar Association begins ethics proceedings. By day 7, his office is closed. By day 14, his name appears in the Portland Oregonian as part of a larger investigation into systematic fraud targeting military families across 4 states. 17 arrests follow. $43 million in fraudulent billing is recovered. 5 hospitals implement new oversight protocols. Dr. Richard Caldwell, age 56, former chief of neurosurgery at Seattle General, accepts a position at a Cascade supplemental insurance office in a strip mall on Highway 217. He works at a folding table beneath a banner that reads affordable coverage for the uninsured. He talks to people who don't want to listen about premium rates that nobody can afford. His small are somehow diminished, the kind of small that comes from understanding you were never as big as you thought. And Master Chief Petty Officer Sarah Chen stands in a private Pentagon ceremony room 6 months later, wearing dress blues with ribbons covering her chest, Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart, and, pinned to her uniform by the Secretary of the Navy himself, the Navy Cross. The citation reads, "For extraordinary heroism and exceptional courage during a 2-year covert operation exposing a nationwide healthcare fraud network that denied treatment to military families." 8-year-old Emma Webb stands beside her, wearing leg braces and a white dress, her face concentrated like someone climbing a mountain that exists only for her. Emma takes her first unassisted step. Then another, reaching Sarah's hand, whispering the name that the Iraqi doctor taught her, the Blue Angel. That evening, Sarah walks through a strip mall. She sees him through the window, Dr. Caldwell, folding table, disinterested customers. She doesn't smile. She doesn't grin. She simply holds his gaze for 5 seconds with the same expressionless mask she wore while picking up the chart he threw at her feet. Then she walks away. Because the ones who have seen the worst often give the most. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.